Cruelty has a way of revealing itself when power falls into the wrong hands, and few acts can be more disturbing than targeting the most vulnerable. Imagine the sheer malice required to see a disabled child, someone already facing daily struggles most of us could never comprehend, and choose to inflict fear, danger, and humiliation upon him. This wasn't a childish prank or an accidental misstep. It was a deliberate, calculated act by a woman who believed she was untouchable. HOA Karen, the self proclaimed queen of neighborhood rules, crossed a line that no decent human being would ever dare approach. She threw a disabled boy into a pool, fully aware that his condition left him helpless in that moment. The cruelty was staggering, the danger life threatening, and the shock rippled through every corner of the community. But cruelty alone isn't what makes this story unforgettable. What makes it extraordinary is what Karen never saw coming. She thought she was picking on a defenseless family, one she could intimidate with her HOA authority and relentless harassment. What she didn't know was that the boy's father wasn't just any man. He was a Navy SEAL, a man trained to face unimaginable adversity, a protector forged in discipline, courage, and strength. This wasn't a father who would cower before HOA rules or neighborhood politics. This was a warrior whose greatest mission was safeguarding his family. The question that echoes is chilling. What could possibly drive someone to target an innocent child? Was it arrogance? Hatred? A twisted hunger for control? And the more urgent question, how far would a Navy SEAL go when his child's life was put in danger? This is not just a story of cruelty, it is a story of justice, of power meeting its match, and of a father who would stop at nothing to defend what mattered most. Karen thought she had control, but she was about to learn the hard way that some battles are fought on an entirely different level. For years, the family had lived what many would call an ordinary life in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The father, a former Navy SEAL, had left active duty to devote his energy to building a peaceful home for his wife and son. Though his past was marked by intense training, grueling missions, and moments that tested the limits of human endurance, his heart had always belonged to his family. His son, born with disabilities that required patience and care, was not a burden, but a gift. Every smile, every small victory, every moment of laughter reinforced what the father already knew. His greatest mission in life was not on foreign soil, but within the walls of his home. The boy's challenges were real and constant. He struggled with mobility, required specialized care, and often felt the weight of being different from the other children in the neighborhood. Yet his spirit was resilient. He loved the simple joys, watching cartoons, splashing gently in the community pool, or sitting on the porch as his father told him stories about bravery and perseverance. These moments were precious, reminders that even in life's difficulties, beauty and love can shine through. His mother, ever watchful and tender, was his anchor, ensuring his medical needs were met and his emotional world was nurtured. Together, the three of them formed a tight bond, one that radiated warmth and resilience. The neighborhood itself seemed welcoming enough at first. Neatly trimmed lawns, cul-de-sacs echoing with children's laughter, and a sense of suburban order made it look like the perfect place to raise a family. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to show, and those cracks had a name: Karen. She was the self-appointed enforcer of the Homeowners Association, a woman who believed the HOA bylaws gave her unchecked authority over everyone around her. For years, she had nitpicked neighbors, slapped fines for trivial reasons, and whispered rumors to sow division. Most families tolerated her antics, believing that ignoring her was easier than confrontation. But for some reason, Karen's focus locked onto this family. Perhaps it was the sight of a boy who didn't fit her vision of a perfect neighborhood. Perhaps it was jealousy toward the parents, who remained kind and respected despite her constant need for control. Or perhaps it was simply her nature. Some people thrive on power, and Karen's power came from making others feel small. Whatever her reasons, the harassment began slowly at first, just subtle digs disguised as concern. She complained about the boy's wheelchair damaging the sidewalks. She raised her eyebrows at the sound of his laughter by the pool, as though joy itself was a disruption. She questioned why the family took up too much space at community gatherings. At first, the parents brushed it off. They had endured worse in life, and they believed rising above her pettiness was the dignified choice. The father, trained in patience and discipline, reminded himself that not every battle deserved his energy. But Karen didn't stop. Small complaints turned into official letters from the HOA. Petty remarks became public confrontations. Soon, fines began to arrive in their mailbox for ridiculous infractions: grass too long by half an inch, a toy left in the yard overnight, or their son's medical ramp being labeled as unsightly. What made the situation even more painful was how it began to affect the boy. He didn't fully understand the intricacies of HOA politics, but he could feel the sting of Karen's disdain. Children are perceptive, and he noticed the way her eyes narrowed whenever she saw him, the way she made him feel unwelcome in spaces where every other child played freely. He started to ask his parents why she didn't like him, why she always seemed angry when he was around. Those questions cut deep into his mother's heart and fueled a quiet fire in his father's. The Navy SEAL father had faced enemies before, men who carried weapons and intentions far deadlier than Karen's. But this battle was different. This wasn't about tactics or strategy on foreign soil. This was about his son's right to exist without shame, fear, or cruelty. He knew that ignoring Karen was no longer an option. The cracks in the neighborhood's peace were widening, and sooner or later, something would break. As the tension grew, so did the father's awareness. He began noticing Karen's patterns, the way she prowled the streets looking for rule violations, the smug satisfaction when neighbors submitted to her will, and the way she deliberately sought moments to target his family. He didn't yet know the full extent of what she was capable of, but instinct told him this was not a woman who would stop on her own. Her hunger for control had grown too strong, and his family had become her chosen target. In many ways, the stage was being set for a clash that would shake the entire neighborhood. What Karen failed to recognize was that in her attempt to intimidate a family, she had unknowingly provoked a man who understood discipline, resilience, and justice on a level she couldn't begin to fathom. The cracks in their quiet life were spreading, and beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one that would ultimately expose Karen's cruelty in ways she never imagined. The more Karen realized she could get away with her petty harassment, the bolder she became. What started as whispers and fines soon evolved into direct confrontations, each one sharper and more humiliating than the last. She seemed to thrive on the discomfort she caused, as if the very sight of the family's resilience drove her to escalate her cruelty. And while other neighbors looked on in silence, too afraid or too indifferent to intervene, Karen's behavior began to spiral into something far darker. The community pool became one of her favorite battlegrounds. To most families, the pool was a place of laughter and relaxation where children splashed freely and parents enjoyed a break from life stresses. But to Karen, it was a stage, an opportunity to assert dominance. She began making comments whenever the disabled boy was present. "He's slowing down the other kids," she muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Or, "This isn't a therapy center, it's a neighborhood pool." Her voice carried the kind of venom that made even strangers uncomfortable, yet she wore her cruelty like a badge of honor. The boy's parents did their best to shield him from her words, but children absorb more than we realize. He grew hesitant to join the others in the pool, always glancing around nervously, afraid of being singled out again. His joy was shrinking, replaced by a quiet shame he should never have carried. For his father, watching this transformation felt like a slow burn inside, a mixture of heartbreak and suppressed fury. But Karen wasn't satisfied with words alone. She started filing official complaints, demanding that the boy be banned from the pool for safety reasons. She argued that his disability posed a liability to the HOA, twisting the very concept of community safety into a weapon against him. It was an outrageous claim, and yet she delivered it with such arrogance that some board members hesitated to challenge her. The family fought back with reason and documentation, proving that their son had every right to use the pool. But the battle left scars, Every letter, every meeting a reminder that their child was being treated as less than human. Then came the breaking point. On a day that should have been ordinary, Karen's cruelty erupted into an act so shocking it stripped away any doubt about who she truly was. With deliberate malice, she pushed the boy into the pool, fully aware of his limitations. She didn't stumble. She didn't trip. She made a choice to place a vulnerable child in mortal danger for no reason other than her own twisted sense of power. The splash was loud, but the silence that followed was louder. In that instant, the boy's life was at risk. He couldn't maneuver like other children. His disability made him panic, his movements slow and clumsy. To Karen, it may have been nothing more than a cruel lesson, but to the boy, it was terror in its purest form. His parents, watching in horror, knew that a single second could mean the difference between survival and tragedy. For his mother, the moment was pure anguish. Her cries cut through the air, a mother's desperate plea as she rushed to help her son. But for his father, something deeper stirred. Years of Navy SEAL training had sharpened his instincts, and in that moment, every ounce of discipline, speed, and focus surged to the surface. Without hesitation, he acted, diving in, pulling his son to safety, and wrapping him in the kind of protective embrace only a parent who has stared death in the face can give. The boy was safe, but the damage was done. Not only had Karen endangered his life, but she had shattered any illusion that her harassment was just neighborhood drama. This was cruelty in its rawest form, the kind that could no longer be excused or ignored. Neighbors who witnessed the act stood frozen, some too stunned to intervene, others finally realizing the monster who had been living among them. Karen, however, remained unrepentant. Instead of apologizing, she twisted the story. He shouldn't have been near the edge, she snapped, as if her victim was to blame. Her words dripped with contempt, her posture radiating smugness, as though she believed even this act of cruelty would fall under her so-called authority. She underestimated one critical truth. This time, she had crossed a line she could never retreat from. For the father, the incident wasn't just a personal attack, it was war. Not in the sense of violence or retaliation, but in the way he had been trained to think, strategically, patiently, and with precision. Karen had revealed her hand, shown her true nature, and in doing so, given him the justification to strike back in a way she would never see coming. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a protector awakened, a Navy SEAL with a mission unlike any he'd faced before. The neighborhood, once quiet and complicit, began to shift. Whispers spread, and for the first time, Karen's grip began to loosen. People who had stayed silent out of fear now questioned their own complicity. They had seen a child thrown into a pool by the very person who claimed to uphold community values. The facade of Karen's authority was cracking, and behind it was nothing but cruelty and corruption. What Karen never realized was that her act of aggression had done more than endanger a child. It had awakened the very force she had underestimated from the beginning. She thought she was targeting a vulnerable family, but in truth, she had provoked a Navy SEAL, a man who had faced enemies far more dangerous than her and emerged victorious. Her arrogance blinded her to the storm that was coming, a storm that would expose her, dismantle her power, and leave her with nothing. This was no longer about HOA rules or neighborhood disputes. This was about justice, about a father's vow to protect his son at all costs, and about a woman who was about to discover that cruelty always has a price. The incident at the pool had done more than just traumatize the family. It had ignited something powerful inside the father. In that moment, when he pulled his son from the water, he felt the same surge of adrenaline he had once known in combat zones overseas. It wasn't the chaotic rush of fear that civilians felt in danger. It was the razor-sharp clarity of a Navy SEAL who knew how to act when every second mattered. He had spent years learning to stay calm under fire, to analyze threats, and to turn chaos into calculated control. Now, he realized those instincts were not part of his past, they were alive inside him, and they were ready to be used again. He didn't react with blind rage, because he knew that was what Karen expected. Bullies thrived when their victims lost control. Instead, he stepped back and started to think strategically. To him, Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor anymore. She was a hostile actor, someone who had crossed into dangerous territory. And just like in his military days, he understood that beating such an adversary wasn't about brute force. It was about patience, discipline, and using her arrogance against her. The first step was intelligence gathering. He began observing Karen closely, paying attention to her routines, her alliances within the HOA, and the ways she manipulated neighbors into silence. SEALs were trained to notice the small details most people missed: patterns of behavior, weaknesses in authority, pressure points that could be exploited. Karen believed she was untouchable because she had the HOA board wrapped around her finger. But to him, that wasn't a shield. It was her blind spot. At home, he began documenting everything: every insult, every false complaint, every fine she tried to impose, and most importantly, the incident at the pool. He collected statements from neighbors who had witnessed the act, even those who had been too afraid to speak up before. He knew evidence was a weapon as powerful as any he had ever carried in uniform. And while Karen strutted around the neighborhood, confident she had once again cowed her opponents, he was quietly assembling a case that would one day dismantle her entire hold on power. But this wasn't just about paperwork and meetings. His instincts told him that Karen wouldn't stop at harassment. She had already proven she was willing to endanger a child. That meant he needed to harden his defenses at home. He upgraded their security system, not because he was paranoid, but because he knew the value of deterrence. Motion sensors, cameras, and alarms became part of their household, not only to protect his son, but to make sure that if Karen or anyone she influenced crossed the line again, it would be caught and exposed. Still, he wasn't content with playing defense alone. SEALs were trained to anticipate the enemy's next move, and Karen was predictable in her unpredictability. She thrived on confrontation, on moments where she could embarrass others publicly. So he made a conscious choice. He would not shy away from her anymore. Instead, he began meeting her provocations with calm, unwavering composure. When she sneered insults, he didn't flinch. When she tried to corner him in HOA meetings, he countered with facts, delivered with the authority of a man who had faced far greater pressure than a suburban bully. His calmness rattled her. Karen was used to people losing their temper, storming away, or shrinking under her glare. But when she was faced with someone who refused to give her that satisfaction, she began to falter. Her voice grew sharper, her tactics more desperate, and her behavior more erratic. Neighbors who once tolerated her out of fear started to notice the cracks in her mask. Where she had once seemed powerful, she now looked petty. Where she had once commanded silence, she now exposed herself as unstable. At the same time, the father understood that winning this battle wasn't just about Karen. It was about restoring dignity and safety for his son. Every night, he sat with the boy and reminded him that he was strong, valuable, and loved. He shared lessons from his time in the SEALs, not about war, but about resilience. How true strength wasn't about muscles or medals, but about never letting anyone convince you that you were less. The boy listened, his confidence slowly rebuilding. Karen had tried to strip him of joy, but his father was determined to show him that courage could grow even in the face of cruelty. As days turned into weeks, the father began crafting a plan that combined all of his training: patience, documentation, timing, and execution. He wasn't going to simply fight Karen on her terms. He was going to dismantle her carefully constructed empire of fear piece by piece. Just as in missions overseas, he knew victory wasn't about one dramatic strike. It was about steady, relentless pressure until the enemy had nowhere left to stand. What Karen didn't realize was that she had awakened not just a protective father, but a man whose very identity was built on overcoming threats. She had mistaken kindness for weakness, silence for submission. But now she would face the reality that her target wasn't powerless. He was a Navy SEAL, disciplined and unyielding, and he wasn't going to stop until justice was done. And as he prepared for the battles ahead, court hearings, HOA meetings, and confrontations with neighbors who had once been silent. He carried with him the same mindset that had carried him through the most dangerous missions of his life. Failure was not an option. For weeks, the father had been preparing, and now the moment had arrived to take the fight directly to Karen, not with fists or fury, but with precision, patience, and power. This wasn't a neighborhood squabble anymore. This was a mission, and like every mission he had undertaken as a Navy SEAL, he approached it with discipline and strategy. Karen had built her dominance on intimidation and manipulation. To dismantle her, he needed to strip away her illusion of authority, expose her lies, and make sure she was cornered by her own actions. The first step in his counterattack was subtle but effective: reclaiming space. Karen thrived in public confrontations, especially at HOA meetings, where she would raise her voice, drown out opposition, and frame herself as the protector of the neighborhood. But this time, when she tried her usual tactics, the father walked in with a binder filled with evidence. Dates, times, photos, written testimonies from witnesses. Every page documented Karen's harassment and the incident at the pool. And when she tried to dismiss him with her mocking laughter, he didn't argue. He calmly read the facts, line by line, each one backed with proof that silenced the room. For the first time, Karen didn't look like the authority. She looked like the aggressor. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They had tolerated her out of fear, but when confronted with the reality of her cruelty, especially toward a disabled child, something changed. Her power, they realized, was an illusion maintained only as long as people let her get away with it. And now, someone was standing up to her, not with empty words, but with undeniable truth. But the father knew public exposure wasn't enough. Bullies like Karen didn't back down easily. They doubled down when cornered. So he layered his strategy. He filed formal complaints with the HOA board, ensuring that every attempt she made to dismiss him would be recorded. He contacted local authorities, not just to report the pool incident, but to make sure her harassment was documented on an official level. He even consulted with legal professionals, quietly laying the groundwork for potential lawsuits. Every move was deliberate, every step calculated. To Karen, it might have looked like he was just filing paperwork, but in reality, he was tightening a net around her, one she wouldn't be able to escape. At the same time, he worked to shift the perception of the neighborhood. For years, Karen had spread gossip, turning neighbors against each other to maintain her control. But the father knew something Karen had overlooked. People craved stability and fairness more than drama. He began building quiet alliances, offering to help neighbors with small tasks, showing kindness where Karen had shown hostility. Soon, stories of his character began circulating, contrasting sharply with Karen's reputation. Where she had built resentment, he was building trust. Where she had sown fear, he was planting respect. Karen, of course, didn't take this quietly. She escalated, as bullies always do when they feel their grip slipping. She attempted new fines, fabricated new accusations, and even tried to rally her few loyal supporters to shame him publicly. But each time, the father responded with the same calm, unshakable resolve. When she claimed his yard violated HOA standards, he produced photos showing compliance. When she accused his son of being disruptive, he presented testimony from teachers and therapists highlighting the boy's resilience and discipline. Every false move she made only added to the growing pile of evidence against her. And while Karen spiraled, he stayed grounded. His military training had taught him the power of patience, never rushing into an ambush, never acting on impulse. He knew Karen's ego would be her downfall, and all he had to do was keep applying pressure until she imploded under her own arrogance. Then came the pivotal moment. At a major HOA meeting, Karen launched into one of her infamous tirades, pointing fingers, hurling insults, and demanding fines against multiple families, including his. But this time, the father was ready. He stood, calm and steady, and presented a meticulously organized packet to every board member in the room. Inside was not only evidence of harassment, but also proof of her misuse of HOA funds, intimidation tactics, and multiple violations of her own rules. It wasn't just an attack on his family anymore. It was a case for her removal. The room shifted instantly. Board members, once fearful of crossing Karen, began questioning her. Neighbors who had been silent victims started speaking up. And Karen, caught off guard, lashed out with wild accusations that only made her look more unstable. For the first time in years, the balance of power in the neighborhood tipped. But the father wasn't done. He knew a single meeting wouldn't topple her. To finish this, he needed to bring in reinforcements beyond the HOA. That's when he reached out to federal authorities. Karen thought her actions were confined to the small world of neighborhood politics, but some of her deeds, misuse of funds, threats, and potential fraud, carried weight far beyond the cul-de-sac. And when federal interest was piqued, it became clear that Karen's reign of terror was about to face a reckoning far greater than she had ever imagined. Still, through it all, the father never lost sight of why he was fighting. This wasn't about personal revenge, even though the anger burned deeply within him. This was about protecting his son, restoring peace to his family, and ensuring that no one else in the neighborhood had to endure Karen's cruelty again. Every move, every calculated step was driven by love, discipline, and the unbreakable will of a father who refused to be intimidated. Karen thought she had the upper hand because she controlled the rules. But what she didn't understand was that she was now up against a man who had fought on battlefields, faced enemies far more dangerous, and never once backed down. She wasn't just losing control of the HOA, she was losing the illusion of power she had built her entire life upon. And once that illusion shattered, there would be no rebuilding it. What began as one act of cruelty at a swimming pool was now unraveling into something far bigger. The fall of a tyrant, exposed for the entire community to see. And the father knew, with absolute certainty, that this was only the beginning of Karen's downfall. Karen's downfall began the moment she underestimated the father's resolve, but her real nightmare started when the situation grew too large for neighborhood politics to contain. Her arrogance had led her to believe she was untouchable, that HOA rules and petty fines could shield her from accountability. But the father's meticulous documentation and strategic patience had transformed her cruelty into a federal matter. And when the FBI arrived, the world Karen had built on fear and manipulation began collapsing faster than she could comprehend. It started subtly: an unmarked car parked near the community, plainclothes agents quietly asking neighbors a few questions. At first, Karen dismissed it as paranoia from her rivals. But then one morning, two agents appeared at her doorstep, badges gleaming, and the reality she had long denied finally sank in. They weren't there to hear her complaints about lawns, fences, or dogs. They were there to ask about financial irregularities, threats against residents, and a pattern of harassment that crossed legal lines. For the first time in her reign, Karen's voice faltered. She could intimidate neighbors, but federal agents were an entirely different battlefield. The investigation moved quickly. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak finally found the courage to share their stories. Years of bullying, fraudulent fines, and mismanagement of HOA funds spilled out in testimony after testimony. Karen had always relied on silence to protect her. But now that silence was shattered, replaced by a flood of truth too overwhelming for her to counter. And with every revelation, the walls around her power crumbled. The father, meanwhile, stayed composed. He didn't gloat, didn't celebrate prematurely. His SEAL training reminded him that victory was only certain when the mission was complete. So he continued providing evidence, ensuring that the agents had everything they needed to build an airtight case. He wasn't out for revenge, he was out for justice. This wasn't about humiliating Karen, it was about holding her accountable for the pain she had inflicted, not only on his son, but on countless families in the community. Karen, desperate to salvage control, tried her usual tricks. She claimed she was the victim of a smear campaign, that the Navy SEAL father was intimidating her, that everyone else was lying. But this time her words fell flat. Federal investigators dealt in facts, not theatrics, and the facts painted a devastating picture: misuse of HOA funds, falsified reports, harassment that bordered on criminal, and the near tragedy of a disabled child pushed into a pool. Each accusation stacked higher than the last until her image as protector of the neighborhood was obliterated. The breaking point came at the next HOA meeting, which the FBI agents attended quietly in the back. Karen, visibly unraveling, tried to assert her dominance one last time. She shouted over residents, waved her arms wildly, and attempted to reassert the control she had once commanded. But instead of obedience, she was met with cold stares and quiet murmurs of disapproval. Neighbors who had once bowed their heads in silence now stood tall, emboldened by the presence of authority and the courage of the father who had led the charge. When the board voted to remove Karen permanently, the decision was unanimous. And when she stormed out of the room, her face red with rage, the agents followed, ready to continue the process of dismantling the empire she had built. In the days that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Without Karen's shadow looming over them, residents felt a freedom they hadn't known in years. Families gathered without fear of fines or harassment. Children played outside without whispers of judgment. The atmosphere of fear was replaced by one of relief, unity, and even hope. And at the center of it all stood the Navy SEAL father and his son, symbols of resilience and proof that even the most intimidating bully could be defeated with courage, discipline, and persistence. Karen's legal battles stretched on, but her reputation was already destroyed. She could no longer hide behind HOA rules or manipulate frightened neighbors. The truth was out, and with the FBI involved, her life of control was over. What she had thought was her kingdom turned out to be nothing more than a fragile illusion, shattered the moment someone stood up against her with strength she couldn't match. For the father, the victory wasn't about headlines or recognition. It was about walking into his home, looking into his son's eyes, and knowing he had kept his promise to protect, to defend, and to fight for justice. The scars of the ordeal remained, but so did something far stronger: resilience. His son, once shaken by Karen's cruelty, now walked with new confidence, knowing his father would always stand for him. In the end, Karen had believed she could break a family by exploiting their vulnerability. Instead, she exposed her own weakness: the arrogance of underestimating a man whose life was dedicated to protecting others. And while she faced the consequences of her actions in courtrooms and investigations, the father and his family found peace in knowing they had not only survived but prevailed. What Karen never understood was that true power doesn't come from rules, intimidation, or fear. It comes from love, integrity, and the unwavering courage to protect what matters most. And in this story, power was never hers to hold. It belonged to the Navy SEAL father, his son, and the community that finally found its voice. When the dust finally settled, the neighborhood looked nothing like the battlefield it had once been. The echoes of Karen's reign, the constant tension, the endless arguments, the fear of stepping out of line had been replaced with something few thought possible: peace. For the first time in years, families could breathe without waiting for the next knock on the door, the next fine slipped under a mat, or the next public shaming at an HOA meeting. The air felt lighter, conversations warmer, and laughter echoed in streets where silence had once reigned. The Navy SEAL father, though proud of the outcome, knew this was never about victory in the traditional sense. This was about reclaiming dignity for his family and proving that cruelty could not go unchallenged. He hadn't fought for applause or recognition. He fought because a line had been crossed, and no one, least of all his disabled son, should ever feel unsafe in their own community. His quiet strength, his discipline, and his refusal to be broken reminded everyone that true courage isn't loud or boastful, it's steadfast and unyielding, even in the face of relentless cruelty. For his son, the transformation was profound. What had begun as a terrifying ordeal became a lesson in resilience. He no longer carried the weight of Karen's cruelty on his shoulders. Instead, he walked with his head held high, inspired by the knowledge that he was not alone, that his father would always stand with him, and that no bully, no matter how powerful, could define his worth. The pool, that had once been a place of fear, slowly became a place of healing, a reminder not of trauma, but of triumph. The neighbors, too, carried their own lessons forward. Many had realized how easy it was to remain silent in the face of injustice, convincing themselves that it was someone else's problem. But when Karen's empire fell, they saw that silence had only fueled her power. It was courage, one man's refusal to back down, that had brought change, and that courage inspired them to find their own voices, ensuring that no tyrant would ever rise unchecked again in their community. Karen's name became a cautionary tale, not just in that neighborhood but far beyond. She had believed that control, manipulation, and fear could build an empire. What she never understood was that empires built on cruelty eventually collapse under their own weight. And while she faced the consequences of her choices in courtrooms and investigations, her victims found strength in the knowledge that justice, though sometimes slow, always finds its way to the truth. This story is not just about a Navy SEAL father and his son. It is about every family who has ever been silenced by intimidation, every child who has felt powerless against cruelty, and every community that has forgotten the power of unity. It is a reminder that strength is not measured by domination, but by the courage to protect, to stand tall, and to fight for what is right even when the odds seem impossible. And now, as this story closes, there's one more lesson to carry with you. Silence helps the bully, but courage inspires change. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, made you hopeful, or reminded you of the strength it takes to stand up for what is right, don't let it stop here. Let it fuel you. Share it, speak it, and most importantly, make sure you never stand silent when cruelty rears its head. Backhand index pointing right, and before you leave, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. HOA denied access. Every story here carries the weight of truth, courage, and justice. Stories that remind us that even the strongest bullies can be defeated, and even the quietest voices can spark change. Click that button, join this community, and let's continue standing together against cruelty. Because in the end, it's not the bullies who define the world, it's the brave who refuse to bow to them.